Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome to a special collaboration between Darwinian Delusions and Pondering Soul. So just a bit of background on this. I got an email from a brother about an article that he'd written about science as art. Being as lazy as I am, I didn't actually check the email for a long time. And when I checked it, I read the article. Phenomenal, mashallah. I really think Muslims should be articulating Islam in a very powerful intellectual way, and the guest today is definitely one of those people, mashallah, that can articulate Islam in such a way. So as a quick, before I introduce other things about Yusuf, I'd just like to ask Yusuf to introduce himself and what we're going to be covering today.
Assalamu alaikum. So I'm Yusuf. I'm a philosophy student. I just recently graduated this year, and at the moment I'm focusing on trying to establish myself with a YouTube channel. I've got a blog as well, ponderingsoul.blog, and then Pondering Soul's the YouTube channel as well. And so I'm just kind of working on writing on that. Main interests are things like phenomenology, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, just general philosophy as well, so and politics. And so just engaging with that on YouTube, on my website, and mainly on Twitter as well, with back and forth with atheists and people of particular political persuasions.
Excellent, mashallah. And you yourself used to be an atheist.
I was, yeah.
From what I read about you.
Yeah. I was born into a Catholic family. So I was raised Roman Catholic, went to Catholic school, had a Catholic education. And then in my teens, I was a bit more rebellious. I ended up kind of moving away from that and being more of a dogmatic atheist. Then over time inclined towards agnosticism. And then I did a bit of traveling, ended up getting interested in Buddhism, stayed in some temples, and then ended up in Malaysia for a while, where there's a lot of Muslims. And so I was exposed to that again a bit, and then ended up finishing traveling, came back, did a lot of reading, and alhamdulillah, ended up reverting to Islam about 5 years ago. So maybe a year, well, not even a year after I got back from traveling.
MashaAllah. You made a bit of a distinction which people don't make. You said that you were first an atheist and then an agnostic. People usually use those terms interchangeably.
Yeah.
So what was the difference?
Well, when I say I was an atheist, I was I held the positive belief that there wasn't a God. So I'd make a claim.
Atheist,
yeah. and I believe that I knew that, and that I was sure of it, and I had my reasons for it. But there was no question in my mind that there wasn't a God, and also that religion itself, as far as I could see, was just like a tool for the powerful to control the weak, kind of thing.
Classical stuff.
Yeah, so I had that typical view. And then when I say I became agnostic, that was through, alhamdulillah, it was through discussions with a couple of Muslim brothers that worked with me in Pizza Hut. And they worked in the kitchen, I worked in the front of house, but we used to kind of meet up and I don't know if you know Winslow Road in Manchester.
Yeah, of course, man.
Yeah, it's,
who doesn't know that place?
Curry Mile.
No problem, Mancunian, unless you've been down there. Yeah.
And so we used to go there quite a lot and go get food and stuff. And I've always been, even though I only recently started studying philosophy when I did my degree, I've always been someone who likes to question things too much to the point that it usually annoys the people I'm talking to. But alhamdulillah, the people that I was with in this particular instance, they were very patient with me. And they bared with my awkward questions, and they went down that rabbit hole with me. And even if they didn't know an answer, they would tell me they were going to go find it out. They didn't just give me answers based on ignorance. They were quite honest and open. If there was something that confused them, they'd tell me, go find an answer, and then the next time we met up, we'd go through it again.
MashaAllah.
So there was a bit of back and forth with them, and through that conversation, I pretty much got convinced that maybe I was being a bit arrogant in the proposition that I knew there wasn't a God. and
Sure.
that I should have at least been open to the possibility, and that my position is one of ignorance and not of knowledge. And yeah, so
Excellent, mashallah.
kind of opened up to agnosticism at that point.
That yeah, that's very it's very different to a lot of atheists. A lot of atheists would be what we would call agnostics, but you obviously went through that extreme phase. Now, about your you did a degree in philosophy,
Yeah,
and when I was going through the actual modules, mind, reason, and reality. That you
yeah,
know,
that
and
was a good one.
it because I know how difficult this stuff is. This is like, and I'm looking at the results, mashallah. It was all like above distinction, like clearly above distinction, and overall, mashallah, distinction. And it's very hard to do in philosophy. So before we get into obviously the topic today, science as art, just to make sure that our viewers know that you know what you're talking about. In your modules, you covered really deep subjects: mind, reason, reality, metaphysics, um, Kant and Hegel, right? Theism and paganism, death, God, and the meaning of life, of course, Nietzsche. Yeah, just very interesting stuff, mashallah.
Yeah, they
And
were.
of course, with a philosophy degree, you'd cover all sort of areas. But what was your actual dissertation on?
My dissertation was on Nietzsche and nihilism. So I focused
Nice.
in on this concept that Nietzsche kind of dealt with and explained throughout a lot of his books, that the West is currently undergoing something big, and that's the result of what he referred to as the death of God. He didn't mean it in any literal sense. He meant it in the sense that the West had kind of let go of this belief that
Yeah.
God was a thing, but they made the assumption that their moral systems were self-evident,
Yeah.
and that they were going to experience a crisis because of this, because the whole premise of Christianity is that God is all-knowing, the all-wise, and only he can provide a system that is perfect, and by that distinction as well, unquestionable, and that we are finite, and any kind of deviation away from that system would have to be, by definition, a decline. And so that's how Christianity works. But then if you get rid of the idea of God, then that unquestionability disappears, and everything
Yeah.
becomes up for scrutiny. And so
Yeah.
that when you're looking at like the history of Western philosophy, that is exactly what you watch happening, is this process of questioning absolutely everything. And then Nietzsche was watching this and seeing that how that it was leading the West into this a societal nihilism. And he
Yeah.
meant that because there's like with things like Rick and Morty, they make it sound like it's something you choose. Like, I'm a communist, I chose to be a communist. I'm a Muslim, I chose to be a Muslim. I'm X, Y, Z. For Nietzsche, nihilism wasn't so much a choice as it was a psychological condition that people underwent because of exhaustion. And he was looking at the Western condition, or the Western context, and he was seeing how this was giving rise to that exhaustion. And you get this through an abundance of choice, too many things to look at, too many things to choose from, and this kind of movement towards absolute freedom. And that when you have too much choice, that it can often lead you to not being able to make a choice at all.
Yeah.
And
Decision paralysis.
yeah, exactly. So you end up in this sort of paralysis. And so my dissertation was just covering that. It was in 3 parts. So part 1 was covering that whole idea of what nihilism is according to Nietzsche, and then moving on to how people in the past have tried to deal with that, which basically starts to introduce the existentialists that responded to a lot of Nietzsche's work. So people were starting to read Nietzsche and really clock onto what he was saying, and that, well, what do we do now? We've lost the thing that gave us the West meaning.
Meaning, yeah.
How do we bring that back again? And so certain philosophers would do it in different ways. Kierkegaard, he was a Christian philosopher from, I think, Denmark, and he was obviously, because he was a Christian, he was trying to get people to acknowledge this leap of faith. And so whether or not things seem absurd, you just kind of submit to that, and you make a leap of faith into religion, for him specifically Christianity. And then there was other ones like Albert Camus, there was a few others as well, but Albert Camus is the one that I kind of hone in on, and he has this atheist kind of approach to existentialism in contrast to Kierkegaard's theistic one. And
Interesting.
yeah, and so I'm trying to kind of compare them to. I show how even though the atheist Albert Camus was, or maybe he was agnostic, but he was kind of damning off the idea of faith, and he would make it sound as if he didn't act on faith. That his he describes it in one part of his work where he's on the precipice of a cliff, and Kierkegaard takes the leap of faith off the cliff, but he stands there, and that somehow made him superior because he refused to take the jump. But then I kind of tried to point out that this is still a leap of faith without the leap. Like he's decided that the better option is to stay there, despite not having the hindsight to know whether or not it was the better decision. And so, yeah, I kind of go through that and then move into Viktor Frankl in part 3, and this idea of the will to meaning, the idea of the conflict between free will and determinism, how these trying to battle with these ideas can lead to existential crisis or to nihilism. But then a submission to the fact that there may be a higher principle that unites them. And then just kind of dealing with that in a more modern sense. So
maybe we can do a separate actual podcast collaboration, whatever you want to call it, on that, because you know, nihilism is such a underestimated topic in the Dawah, that this is really what atheists need to face. And they have all these different, you know, veneer coverings to try and just make life have some sort of meaning. But when you actually deeply think about it, that's the only real conclusion, that it has no meaning. It's all meaningless.
Yeah, and some of them are really honest, and they'll admit that, and they'll admit that meaning is a fleeting creative endeavor, and that you've got to create it for yourself and things like that. But I disagree to a certain degree. I think meaning is something that you have to find or discover. That it isn't something you can just invent, and that when you do try to invent it, there's a fakeness about it that you know is fake, and you feel it when you're trying to engage with it. And there's an insincerity about it. It feels more like rebelling for the sake of rebelling, and trying to stand out or trying to be different. But then there's a problem with that as well. If everyone is trying to be different, then you're not really being that different, because you're conforming with this idea that everyone needs to be different. But yeah, it's a weird one.
You know, when I think about the new atheist movement, they focus a lot on society. You know, we want to make the world a better place. And one of the former atheists, like a really militant atheist who now sort of works in the Dawah, he gave me this this very simple way of thinking about it. He said, better in what way? Like, what exactly is better? Because if the world is pointless, then pointless can't be better. It's just pointless.
Yeah,
you know, it's just, there's no standard.
It completely destroys any sort of spectrum of value. You're just left with nothing. Meaning is fleeting, and if it's fleeting, and if everything is just doomed for this nothingness in the end, even that fleeting meaning ultimately is underpinned by nothing. And that's something that if you do commit to that on your deathbed, it's not really much to take with you. Like, it's not.
No, definitely.
Yeah. It needs a large amount of anxiety.
Okay, so moving on to the topic of science as art, right? So before we get into it, I'd just like to ask all the viewers on Darwinian Delusions and anybody else watching on any other channel, I really recommend you read this article. And even if you really enjoyed this video and everything that we go through in terms of the content, it's really worth going through. It's not that long, but I found that it took ideas which are well known within philosophy, but then it just puts them in a certain way that it gives you a different sort of paradigm. And that's what I found quite interesting. And also that it's very little work has been done about Nietzsche's views about the philosophy of science, about science. So, Yusuf, to start off with, what are the main themes of this article? This essay.
Okay, so the essay is just trying to deal with this idea that science has forgotten that it's art, and that it has to make use of art in order to communicate things, and this is mainly due to the condition that the human being finds themselves in the fact that they're finite, and like whatever they look at, whatever they focus at, they have to neglect a lot. And this is inescapable for the human being. They, like, in talking to me now, you have to neglect everything that's behind you. You have to neglect what's going on in the next room, and then everything in the universe that kind of goes beyond that. You have to kind of hone in on something, and this leads a lot of time to misunderstandings in communication. You see that a lot. And also, if you transfer it into the realm of science, they don't escape this. They suffer from it as well. They're still human beings, but they talk as though they kind of achieve this perspectiveless perspective, which is a bit of an oxymoron. This is the objective state of mind. They release themselves, so they flush out any subjectivity, and they approach something rationally and level-headedly. But for the most part, I think this is quite a myth. That is, the scientist isn't this kind of enlightened being, as they try to make it out to be. And with their methods of communication having to resort to art, this makes the whole process of kind of communicating everything even more difficult. And with Nietzsche, the way he kind of points this out is he makes use of the word metaphor a lot. And so science has to resort to metaphor. And this is what art is. It's with art, you try to lead someone towards some sort of truth, but you have to utilize a lie, quote unquote, to do that. So you have to kind of mislead them in a way, in the hope that they'll be able to work through that misleading and get through the layers, and then achieve, quote unquote, truth at the end of that. But it's a process. It's not something that's self-evident. It's not something you can just kind of pass to someone like you would do a box with something in it. It's something that you can only really show people how to think, not what to think. And they have to, once learning how to think, deal with these issues themselves to try and get to that. So a really good example, and one that I point out in the essay, is the atom. The reason we have the word atom is it derives from the ancient Greek atamos, which is not divisible. But we know, because of the atom bomb and the Hadron Collider, that the atom is divisible. And the only reason they called it an atom was because they thought they couldn't do that in the first place. But they didn't change the name. They kept it, and they moved on and readapted themselves. And then with the image, so I say atom, and there's an image that pops into your head. And there's a problem with that image, and the issue is that the atom doesn't look like that. It's art, and it helps you understand a very complex idea, and it's very useful. It's very pragmatic in terms of, like, if you understand it like this. I studied combined science before I did philosophy in university, and when we were going through chemistry and physics and things like that, and we were understanding the atom and how it was structured, these images really do help you kind of picture what the atom is and how it's structured and things like that, and how it works, and how molecules end up forming based on ionic bonds and things like that. But the art itself is misleading. The reason is because the atom is ridiculously tiny, and it's not even clear whether or not saying that it looks like anything makes any sense. Because when we're talking about what things look like, we're talking about a subjective experience that the human being has in relation to things around it. But the atom is in a different world, pretty much. It's on the quantum level. And a really good example of this issue is the microscope has a limit on how far you can zoom in because of the wavelength of light. And then once you get smaller than the wavelength of light, things become blurry. And then they had to move from that to the electron microscope so they could start to see smaller things. But then again, the electron microscope is itself using the wavelength of the electrons to kind of see things, simply put. But you can't then use that to have a look at atoms. So this thing that we keep talking about it's beyond the horizon of experience. But we utilize these images and we teach it to kids, and that's fine. Like, I'm not anti-science, and I don't think we should just stop using this image. But then they grow up thinking that this use of art and this use of misleading representation is itself an absolute truth, and they never discuss the philosophy of science. And this is one of the issues that I had when I was studying science in college. My intention was to move on to study zoology. I wanted to work with animals, and combined science was my method of doing that. But then I found that during the entire course, there was all these things that would pop up, and then all these questions would arise, and I'd want to ask the questions, but there was an issue with me asking them because it derailed the class too much. And they weren't, and the teachers were great. They weren't like, they weren't being mischievous, or like there was no conspiracy or anything. They had a job to do. They had to make me able to show when I went to university that I knew X, Y, Z. And so, they had a course to get through, and me asking these questions and derailing the class wasn't productive. So they would have to kind of stop me from doing that. And it was with everything, because we were doing chemistry, physics, biology. And so this idea, for example, at the moment, we understand that the Earth revolves around the sun. Yeah. And, that you can have a very beautiful picture if you imagine the sun at the center of the solar system and the Earth going around it. But and that's fine, I accept that. I'm not trying to say that the Earth is the center of the solar system. But this idea of a center is relative. You pick a center, and once you've picked a center, a picture might seem either more beautiful or more symmetrical, or it might seem a bit more chaotic. If you pick the center as the Earth, the sun still revolves around the Earth, and other things do. The picture is just very chaotic. If you pick the biggest object, because the center of mass is very much at the center of the bigger one, the image comes out much more aesthetically pleasing. And so we can choose that. And it's this use of language, it's deceiving. And so people completely neglect this in conversation. And so they'll look at the past, and they'll look at the fact that, say, the Catholic Church said that the Earth was the center of the universe. And they'll say, oh, how stupid they were. And, how unintelligent they were. Well, these people are like, no offense to people who wash pots, but they might as well be like kitchen porters or just working standard jobs. They're not geniuses themselves. If you gave them like all the material to build a grand cathedral or mosque, there'd be no way they could do that. But these people in history, they were able to achieve amazing feats. They made amazing discoveries, and it doesn't make sense just to call them stupid because they relatively picked a center, which itself is a relative decision. And a subjective one. It's based on perspective, and things like that.
So what's interesting about what you in the article is when you put down a quotation of Nietzsche, where he makes it clear that it's when science goes past its limits of what it's capable of doing that it turns into art, rather than just all of science is art. Right at the beginning, you make that distinction.
Oh, yes. That's a quote from Birth of Tragedy. And what he's talking about there is that Kant alludes to this a little bit. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he talks about the fact that we have this horizon, and that when you try to venture beyond the horizon, while not actually crossing that horizon. So if you imagine you're on an island and you're looking over into the distance, you can see everything that's between you and the horizon. If a ship appears and it's moving around, you can have a look at it and you can see it floating about. If it ventures beyond that horizon, it's no longer within sight, and you can talk about it and postulate about it and say, oh, well, you know, it moved in this direction, the wind's heading there, so on and so forth. Maybe I can assume that it's moving to this part of the world or that part of the world. And science has to do this. And they invent certain technology that might assist them in being able to do that better. But the problem with this is, again, the issue with the human condition, in that when we neglect something, we don't know that we're neglecting it. You know, by definition, if it's neglected, how would you even be able to be aware of the fact that you've not taken it into consideration? And when we're talking about things on the quantum level and on the astronomic level and things like that, we really do reach beyond human experience, and we rely on our technology to be able to do that. And once you've done this, you're then adding extra layers of complexity, and this makes it difficult to know for sure what you're neglecting anymore. With simple things, like if you're doing an experiment in a lab in your, you know, in your office or whatever it is that you're doing it in, there's not as much to account for, and you can like make sure your beakers are clean. You know, you have a lot of stuff that you can do to make sure that the results of your tests come out perfect, or as perfect as possible. When it comes to dealing with the quantum, and when it comes to dealing with the astronomical, it's not as easy as like giving things a wipe and things like that. There's all sorts that goes on out there, and if we're not aware of something's existence, we can't account for it. And we have this very finite perspective, and we're trying to use these tools in order to kind of extend our senses. But we don't really understand what the consequences are of that extension, because it's new. We've only had to deal with it over the past century or so, or maybe a couple of centuries since the early modern period. But we're dealing with this at the moment. And you can see it a lot as well. Like science is having a problem at the moment. It's called the replication crisis, where a very large percent of scientific experiments, they're not repeatable. And people like Richard Dawkins, they like to talk as though the scientific community is hell-bent on truth, and that's all there.
One monolithic thing. Like science is one thing.
And so when they're talking about things like you mentioned a lot in your videos, Darwinian evolution, as if it's the truth, the absolute truth. You know, he's received it from a source of complete knowing, and it's very religious in the way they talk. And I know they hate hearing things like this. But it's true. They rely on faith a lot, and they try to neglect this truth a lot. But
you know, I've highlighted a few parts of the article which I really liked, so I'm gonna not cover them in order, because I thought I just liked some things more than others, right? So when you were speaking about representation of reality and, you know, finite minds and stuff, so let's just assume the sort of naturalistic view that we evolved over billions of years under evolutionary pressures, and our minds, like you highlight in the article, they were designed for survivability, not truth. And you give a really good example of
the beetle.
What's that? Yes, please.
Yeah, the Australian jewel beetle. So, sorry, the Australian jewel beetle is an interesting one, because basically it evolved over a certain amount of time to be able to recognize large, shiny brown objects as mates. And so when they're flying over the Australian outback, they'd hunt these objects down. And when they would find them, they would hone in and mate with them. And the Australians, they really like their beer. And what ended up happening is they were producing their alcohol in these brown, shiny bottles, and just throwing them, because they've also apparently got a litter problem. And the beetles had no way of being able to distinguish a brown beer bottle with a potential mate. And there was an issue that was recorded in that they'd kind of got themselves caught in this evolutionary trap where their senses had developed in such a way as that they weren't concerned with truth, but with utility, with pragmatic approaches to, the world that they were finding themselves in. And these scientists, they were basically keeping an eye on these beetles, and they were noticing that they were landing on these brown beer bottles, and they would mate with them to exhaustion, and they would die as a result of this, or they would be picked off by other bugs or predator animals,
They're
birds.
humping themselves dry to death.
Yeah, pretty much exactly that. And so this was a problem for the species as a whole, and they had to implement a few things and try to like solve the problem so that the beetles weren't going to face this kind of issue. But it highlights the problem with thinking that evolution leads to this the production of faculties which incline towards truth rather than utility, and that they're absolute rather than pragmatic. It's much more pragmatic. It's much more to do with utility and much more to do with survival than it is anything.
Yeah, and so from that perspective, how can we, if we were naturalists, how could we claim, oh, we're arriving at truth when our minds weren't actually designed for that? Now, there's another part I just took out from the essay.
Do you mind if I just say as well, in the sense, if we stick to that point for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
Just as the beetle, when it was engaging with the brown bottle, it had no idea that it wasn't doing something wrong, and if anything, it was really probably impressed with its.
Probably enjoying it.
Yeah, obviously, if it's going to stay there for as long as it can to the point that it dies from exhaustion. But it's very analogous to us as well. Like with science, the brown bottle being science, we being the Australian jewel beetle. We've got this thing, and it's science is producing technology and things, comforts and luxuries, and we're really like pleased with ourselves because we're like, you'll hear when people are kind of talking about, oh, religion's bad because X, Y, Z. Look at science. Look what science has done for us. Funny enough, they talk very similar. Like we say, look what Allah has provided to us. Be thankful to Allah. All praises to Allah. They're like, all praises for science. Look what science has given to us.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got fast cars. I've got a comfortable bed, heating, refrigerators, things like that. And we've become so ingrained with what it's given us. Kind of bringing it back to the beginning of my article, I highlight that we've overlooked the curses that come along with all of these blessings. We've been blinded by the pleasure and the hedonism and the material.
And it made us weak.
And it has.
I really like that part that you highlighted, that it's made us into whiny little,
Yeah. Exactly that. And it's an issue because we've become very reliant on this system. But as atheists like to keep pointing out, everything is temporary, and if the universe is temporary, so is this civilization. It's not that it's going to last forever. And if we've become if we are training the species to become reliant upon this for its survival, if it was to ever fall or crumble, we'd be in massive trouble. And not only that, they like to rely on utilitarianism as well, but if it does fail, there will be pain and suffering on a scale never before seen. And it will be a direct result of our reliance on this.
It will be a Hobbesian Royal Rumble. All against all, painting our faces blue, running after each other with spears. Yeah.
And even more so if we've gotten rid of any sense of eternal judgment afterwards. Because if you've led the whole society into nihilism, and if that society, the system that's holding it in place, collapses for whatever reason, be that environmental or astronomical, then you've got an issue where, like, why should people be good anymore? Why should people not just do what they want if there isn't threat of punishment on this world or the next? If there's no legal system, if there's no, if there's only anarchy, why should I listen to you just because you're being a moral fanatic and you're telling me that this is what's good, that's what's good? If I don't feel like it is and I don't agree with you, I want X, why shouldn't I do it?
So
whatever you say, what you say. Yeah, it becomes a will to power, which is something else that Nietzsche talks about, is that everything devolves into a will to power. Who is the most powerful? And
Yeah.
it kind of derives from, have you read The Republic by Plato?
Nope.
There's a character in there called Thrasymachus, and he's this embodiment. He's like, what is moral is what the leader says is. Whoever the powerful is, when he says X, X is good.
Might is right.
Yeah, exactly that.
Okay, so linking to the love-struck beetle, there's a part of the article in which you write about the atheists. They deny that objective facts have their roots in pragmatic views of truth and intersubjective experience, because that sounds too much like it's calling it subjective. So, can you explain what you mean, what is meant by pragmatic views of truth, and why that's important in the context of these dialogues about science and certainty?
Okay, so you talk about Kuhn a lot.
Yeah.
I've only recently been introduced to this philosopher of science, but this is something that is echoed in other parts of philosophy, and especially in terms of epistemology, and how do we define truth? What is truth, and how do we know things? And then how can we justify it as a true belief? And so when I'm saying that science is pragmatic, I mean it simply in the sense that it's a developing theory, which they're happy to admit, and that it depends on the consensus of a group of people. And this group of people are not absent of social pressures. They can incline to certain things and certain morals and certain values, and this affects the direction that science heads in.
Yeah.
And if you have a society, for example, that values material goods, hedonism and things like that, you'll see that science will revolve around this idea of producing luxuries and producing medicines and things like that, so people can live longer and more pleasurable lives. And this isn't so much a concern for truth as it is for being comfortable and for having a life that's free from suffering and free from struggle. And it's making lots of assumptions here. It's first of all made the assumption that suffering isn't necessary. And this isn't an obvious claim. It might very well be that suffering is crucial for the human condition, and that any form of greatness is something that derives from a struggle, derives from having to deal with pain and suffering and overcoming it, and that this is itself something that might be important for the development of the mind. But if science isn't considering its assumptions, then it just powers ahead like a teenage boy that's just gotten a first car, and like he's like, yeah, look at this, it's great, and he just slams his foot down. He wants to go as fast as he can without really considering his motivations, his intentions for doing that.
Or the moral imperatives,
yeah, and he just ends up crashing in the wall as a result of his arrogance. So science is focused on this pragmatic sense of truth. It just wants to develop things that work. I think you're probably better at explaining in terms of the Kuhnian sense of this process of revolution and the
paradigm shifts.
Paradigm shifts. And go on, sorry.
No, go on.
So the intersubjectivity bit. This.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
This is an important part, because there's when you hear people like Richard Dawkins talk, and when you talk to the layman about what is subjectivity, what is objectivity, they will often talk as though subjectivity is synonymous with falsity, or it's just emotions, it's this, it's that, and the other. You want to avoid subjectivity, it's bad, nasty, yak. And objectivity, that's truth, that's absolute truth, that's something you can't doubt, and like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, it's true whether or not you believe it is. Now, there's an issue with this kind of dichotomy, because it neglects the fact that they are reliant upon each other, that they're like hot and cold. These terms are defined by each other. You can't come up with the idea, like if you check the definition of objective, And I did do, and it uses the word subject in the definition. The objective is, or the object is that which is separate from the subject. And so in this idea, or in this definition, if you don't have a subject from which the object is separate from, the concept of object dissolves. Now, this isn't to say that objects don't exist if humans don't exist. Like, I'm not trying to do a Berkeley, everything is mind thing. It's just that these concepts themselves, as we use them, their meaning relies upon each other. And again, with the subject, you can't have a subject without objectifying the subject in the first place.
Yeah.
And so each concept presupposes the other, and if you get rid of one, the other dissolves. Now, when I say that the objective derives from the intersubjective, what I'm saying is that the processes of discovering objective truths relies on the collected experience of multiple subjects, hence intersubjective. And there's a really good point that Berkeley makes, although I just mentioned him a moment ago. John Locke makes this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And I think this is where the ideas of objective qualities and subjective qualities come from. And so he says secondary qualities rely on the primary. And so you have things like color and smell and taste and things like this. These are all what we could classify as subjective. And he says then that these secondary qualities they come from the brain or from the mind. And the observer, when he's looking at things, gives rise to subjective qualities or to secondary qualities. Primary qualities are qualities that you find in the objects themselves. And so you have shape, width, mass, things like this. These are objective qualities that you find in the object itself. And then Berkeley comes along and he says, well, hold on a minute. You're saying that primary qualities do not rely on secondary qualities, but secondary qualities rely on primary. But this isn't true. How can you try to imagine an apple without a color, without a shape, without a color, without a smell, without a taste? What is this? What would this be? There wouldn't be anything left. You wouldn't be able to experience this apple anymore if all that was left was its shape, its weight, its so on and so forth. No, because even weight is somewhat subjective. Weight's relative to the person holding it. And so and this idea of intersubjectivity is basically the idea that you get multiple subjects together, they all come along and they document things, and then what they can all agree on, they write down, well, okay, this is objective, and what they all might disagree on, or what they all might not be able to pinpoint down exactly, gets written off as subjective and less important, without realizing that they weren't able to come to terms of the objective without the subjective in the first place. And so disregarding it is, as far as I'm concerned, is a mistake. That it's it's integral to a part of the human experience. These things have a relationship, and if you neglect one, you neglect a lot.
This is a good segue for my next point, which I was very keen to get onto, which is about social science being influenced by the views of scientists. So science being not totally a social construct, but there is an element of that. So this person that you mentioned, I can't pronounce their name, Hassi.
Yeah, Ulrich Hassi.
Your teacher, right?
Yeah.
So they're Nietzschean scholar, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So they said something very interesting. Nietzsche thus accounts for objectivity as a necessarily communal value, which is to say that it is never free from the exertion of power. If a majority of scientists agree on something, then they have the right and the power to make others agree. If a scientist still refuses to agree, then the majority can, as the 20th century logical positivist Rudolf Carnot has argued, say of them that he is colorblind or a bad observer or fantasizing or a liar or mad, right? So just go on to that point, because this is going to link to what you were saying earlier about Kuhn, and I'm going to try and link the two.
Yeah, so it's basically honing in on the fact that science isn't this perspectiveless perspective. It's not absent of social powers,
Yeah.
and that these people, because if you keep in mind as well, think of the typical scientist that you meet. There's always what's the word? Exceptions to the case.
Black
But
swans.
yeah, but people who are very scientifically minded and who are really good at dealing with these, the geniuses, what you tend to find is that they are somewhat socially awkward.
Yeah.
And that so where they might have mathematical intelligence or scientific intelligence, they would lack in social intelligence. Now this introduces an issue, because if these individuals who might be socially awkward, when it comes to dealing with society, this can affect their value compass, and it can also affect their science as a result. Now, you see this, for example, there was a case where there was a scientist, I can't remember where it was, it might have been Norway, or it was someone that works for CERN, and he was trying to explain why women were not equally represented within the sciences. And he was producing his evidences, and he was producing this and that, and it all seems very reasonable. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot as well. He points out that you can't really have a more egalitarian society than Sweden, and
Yes.
they had this assumption that the differences between the sexes are caused by social conditions. If you remove these social conditions which are causing these differences, then there should be this meeting in the middle, or this merging of the sexes into this one being. And so based on that assumption, the Swedes followed a social principle that tried to get rid of these social conditions, and the opposite effect happened. Instead of making everyone the same, it became more evident that the sexes had their own things going on, that they were different, and that the biological difference between them
They're choosing
affected
different
them.
topics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even from an evolutionary perspective, if you're like a strict materialist atheist and you believe this, it makes sense. If you're saying that, we're developed based on the experiences of the species over a very long period of time, why would you then think that if the social conditions have been X for however many thousands of years, that you could just change the social condition and then everything would be as you hoped it would? It's overly idealistic. If women have been in charge of raising children and doing certain things over a very long period of time, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that they would then develop a biology which would incline them to such things and make it easier for them to be able to deal with these things. And then the same can be said of men. If men have had to deal with hard work, and not that women don't deal with hard work as well, but I mean,
Hunting,
grueling
warfare,
manual labor, warfare, fighting, all of these
pub
things.
fights. Yeah.
Yeah, it would make sense that their biology would be affected by this over a long period of time, and that simply changing the social conditions isn't going to be enough to evolve that. And then you look at the fact that in places like Morocco, they have better rates of females joining the sciences, and they, by all standards, are much less egalitarian than Sweden is. And so there's something weird going on here. They've made a number of assumptions, and these assumptions have shown to be false, and it's affected the paradigm a lot. Now, when it comes to the quote you've just mentioned, the scientists are affected by social powers. And just as this man, he came forward and he put forward the idea that maybe women aren't joining science as much because they just don't like it. He was ridiculed for this. He was lambasted. He was thrown out of the community and and he was removed. And that was the perfect example of this quote, that if someone doesn't agree with the social consensus, whether or not this social consensus is itself rooted in science or rooted in ideology or in anything, this is enough to steer things away from quote unquote truth and towards something else, something, the ideal, the goal, the aim, the wish, the desire. And so that's pretty much what that
It's quite interesting about that, and how that relates to what Kuhn says about paradigms. So his view is that science goes through these periods of normal science and revolutionary science. And you have normal science, you have these anomalies coming, and the old regime, it doesn't allow the new ideas to flourish. The new ideas are there to explain the anomalies, but then the old guard says, no, we don't want change. And Kuhn basically argues that the two paradigms are so different to each other that the old regime, which is controlling, which has the normal science paradigm, they will basically fight and resist any form of change. And when change eventually does happen, because the two paradigms are so distinct, so the example he gives is Newtonian and Einsteinian. They have a different conception of, time and space being fixed in Newtonian, flexible in Einsteinian, and even the definition of mass being different, that you can't make a logical change from one paradigm to another. That's like an irrational decision between the two paradigms. And what's interesting is the history of science shows that. So this example of this logical positivist, I've forgotten his name, Carl something, whatever. So he was right that, to maintain a particular order, if there's somebody standing out being a black sheep, they get in the way of a particular paradigm being accepted, so they should be mocked. And that kind of reminds me of atheist scientists, atheist biologists and philosophers who have been ridiculed, have been called secular creationists, and who've been just absolutely lambasted because they challenge the standard Darwinian story. And when you read their writings, you can just literally see this is what Kuhn was talking about. This is exactly what you wrote in the essay.
Yes, their subjectivity is bleeding through their attachment to a particular thing. They're comfortable with this knowledge, with this certain paradigm, and for that to dissolve leaves them in chaos. And there's a really, really great quote, and I might not do it justice, but in Nietzsche's The Gay Science, he has this parable of the madman. And the madman, it's a beautiful little piece of writing. It's only short, but he basically runs into the town square and he's like, where is he? Where is God? And everyone in the street's laughing at him and ridiculing him and like, oh, but did he get lost? Has he, got stuck somewhere? Like, what do you mean, where is he? And he's visibly distraught, and all these people are just not taking him seriously. And he throws the lamp on the floor and he gets their attention and he goes, we've killed him, all of us, like, we're the cause of his death. And what now? Are we not just what is up, what is down? Are we not just floating through an endless void? And how are we going to clean all of this blood? Like, what are we going to do? And he was pointing out the fact that the people, the laymen, were not taking seriously something that was unbelievably significant. That the society itself neglected the fact that these ideas, when really held sincerely in the hearts of a lot of people, are something that really pushes society along in a particular direction. But then to just get rid of that, to lose it, leaves you in this abyss, in this void, floating with no sense of direction, no up, no down, no right, no wrong, no good, no evil. And if you've got a crowd of people in this position, what you end up with is what was once unified, it becomes fractured and it tears itself apart. And you see this with pretty much every empire that's existed in history, is they get so big and then they kind of lose the ethos that made them so big in the first place. And then they turn in on themselves, because another reason, I guess, is once you've conquered everyone around you, you've spread yourself so thin. And like if once you've gotten so big and you've spread yourself so thin, there's not really much connecting the people anymore. And you just end up with this infighting and this devolution into chaos. And so in comes nihilism, not a rational choice, but an exhaustion, a psychological tiredness that consumes you.
But it's very, very interesting how, what you were mentioning earlier about having this delusion that that you are actually objective um, when you're looking at evidence, because you have presuppositions before that, and people don't realize that those presuppositions exist, and philosophers of science call that theory ladenness. And when you have a group of scientists, they have theory ladenness. They have, data is not just objectively out there, and you highlight that it's not just objectively out there. To grab it, you need to have some sort of working hypothesis already in your head. And what's interesting is Darwin wrote about this, even though philosophy of science didn't really exist at his time. He wrote about this. He said, the idea that you don't start science with a hypothesis, that you just go out and get data. He said, you might as well go to a quarry and just start counting pebbles. It's meaningless.
Yeah.
You have to start off with, okay, what am I looking for? And that will dictate to a large extent what you consider relevant and what you don't consider relevant. So theory ladenness is like impossible to actually
Yeah, you
evade.
need to have objectives, you need to have goals, but these objectives and goals already presuppose a number of things. They presuppose desires, they presuppose aim. And this has a massive effect. There's I mentioned as well in the article Kant, and he
Yes.
really does bring this down to like in a really nice way, should I say. And he talks about the fact that you can't, it's the argument between direct realism or indirect realism. And
Sure.
what his argument is that he calls it the thing in itself. So the object out there, or the objective thing, you can't have direct knowledge of it. And the reason is because any information that you receive from that object is muddled about with by the structures of your mind before it's presented to you. You have the light bouncing off the thing, the light hits your eyes, the light waves are converted into electrons which run through your nerves. Your nerves have got all these things going on in them, all these structures which present that information, attach certain concepts and ideas to it, and then give it to you. And then you're having to deal with this thing after the fact. And scientists they can't get rid of this. They're still human. And it gets even weirder because when you start to, like, say, for example, the scientist looking at the mind, trying to figure out how the mind works, in this process of trying to see how the mind works, you're still dealing with this issue that the brain is reconfiguring the information that it's getting and then processing it and presenting it to you. And that creates a problem, is that, like, to what degree can we say the knowledge of the thing relates to the thing exactly as it is? And for the most part, even the dogmatic scientists and the atheists, what they're presenting to us is pushing them away from this idea that we have a direct experience. When they're talking about reality, they're talking about this world that's not like we experience it. You have this crazy world of atoms and quantum forces and quarks, and even just when you look at the sky, our experience of that is nothing like what it actually is. You've got these quantum strings going through the whole thing, and gravitational forces that you can never really just see. You've got to infer through experimentation, and this really problematizes this idea that of objectivity. If you've not got direct experience of things, if everything is indirect, if everything is inferred and inferred and inferred and inferred, this idea of certainty is dissolved. And it's not to say that science, like I mentioned again in the article, this doesn't mean you should be anti-science. This doesn't mean that you should be a postmodernist. It doesn't mean that you should say that there is no truth and, to hell with it all, because that proposition itself undermines itself straight away. There is no truth. Is that a true statement? No, both of the answers lead you back to the idea that there is truth. And it's just, science can be useful only insofar as we realize its limits, and we are not arrogant in saying we are certain about things when it's clear that we can't be certain about them. But it doesn't mean that we can't utilize them for certain purposes. And how we utilize them and for what purposes depends on the value structure of a society. And that will differ depending on whether you're in like a secular society that values hedonism and materialist luxuries and things like that, or whether you go to, say, like a little village in the middle of nowhere, and they value God and unity and community
Yeah.
and helping each other and suffering with each other,
Yeah.
and not denying this suffering and not being extravagant and you know what I mean, just living simply and for each other rather than for yourself. And
Yeah.
this affects the world that you live in. It affects the way you see it. It affects everything. And the scientists that live in the West that are dealing with these issues, they might be producing us lots of comforts and lots of luxury, but you know, they're also complaining about the results of all of these things simultaneously. They're talking about how all of these things that we have done with science are unfortunately destroying the planet.
Yes.
And what do we do now? And it's like, well, maybe the whole science thing moved a bit too quickly. And
Yeah. And the problem is they talk about science as if it's not value driven, right? It is value driven. So, like you rightly mentioned, science today is more based upon materialism. How can we live longer lives, do this, do that? When science, at the time when the Muslims were doing it, and later on when the Christians were doing it, was a way of trying to get closer to God. And it's more about benefiting mankind. Okay, so just so we don't miss out on this very important point that you mentioned right at the end of the essay, Nietzsche, you say that he basically argues that science, if we truly understand it, it should belong to the domain of morality, which is
it's not that it should, it's that its roots are in it. So basically,
its roots are in it. Okay.
yeah. So for Nietzsche, science isn't this thing that is opposed to religion. He was talking from a very Christian Western perspective. He was embedded into Europe, and
Sure.
so his idea of nihilism could better be called European nihilism. He had awareness of Buddhism, and he talks about it briefly, and he talks a little bit about Islam as well. But when he's talking about nihilism, he's basically staring at the European world and at European philosophy and at what it was undergoing. And he basically diagnosed the fact that science didn't just appear to fight Christianity. Science is what was left after the death of God. So science is Christianity without God. And it was formed on the value that truth is important. But truth is a moral claim. It's not necessarily obvious that you should value truth. This idea that you should value truth for Europe came from Christianity. It put it up there as one of its highest values, and this really helped move the scientific thing along. And so, you look at Newton, and all these people, they weren't atheists. They were really driven by this sense that there is truth, and that they were trying to move towards it. And truth for the sake of truth, not for the sake of power, not for the sake of X, Y, Z. But they all come into play from the humbleness that religion instills. And insofar as you have all of these values that religion gave and forced, then you can have this movement towards truth. Now, the issue is once you've gotten rid of God, again, none of these presuppositions are unquestionable anymore. Yeah. And, for people who really just want to be successful, which is the case whether you're in a religious society or not, these people exist. It affects things. And sorry, I got a bit on a tangent there. I've lost my point a little bit.
No. So you were on tangent, but you forgot
the root. So morality was the root.
Morality,
yeah. So now what we're dealing with is basically the carcass of Christianity. That's what science is. And there is nothing necessary about valuing truth in science, because the only reason,
from an evolutionary perspective, we could just argue that as long as it helps us survive, why should we follow truth? We can follow falsehood if it makes us happy. And
well, look at, for example, the military complex. What is it that's motivating all of these revolutions in armory, in weapon manufacturing? it's not like there are truths involved there, but it's not the highest value. You have to have some sort of value for truth to be able to figure out how you're going to make this particular bomb, how are you going to make this tank, how are you going to make this. But it's not the highest value in the hierarchy of values in the production of these sciences. What's higher on there is dominance, is power, is all of these other things. And you have
arms races and all these stuff.
And you can't just say science is just isolated truth as the only thing that's important, because it's not. Because the only way science can ever make progress is if it's getting funding. And who's giving the funding? If it's not, the scientists aren't just providing it for themselves necessarily. They have to get it from people who sponsor them and things like that. But this is something the scientists complain about all the time, that their research is often directed by where the money's coming from. And this causes issues. And so there was I was watching a podcast with Joe Rogan, and he was talking to a gentleman who he did The Cove, or there was a documentary called The Cove. It was about the mistreatment of dolphins and things like that. And he was talking about the fact that in America they're still pumping sewage into the ocean, and there's these huge pipes, and they're just like,
Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, subhanallah. And they're both sat there, and they're absolutely bedazzled as to how that's even legal. It's like, well, why is this happening? It's to do with costs. It's to do with lots of other things. Like, you can't discount these from science as much as they might like to.
There's an interesting paper I was reading about this, about theoretical conservatism within science because of what they call big science, that research outside of the paradigm is not going to get you the money. So I believe his name is Kyle Stanford. He's a philosopher of science, and he was using this as an argument against scientific realism, that basically the big companies or the money that's being pumped in, that's stopping the objectivity, not objectivity, the direction that science should be going is largely dictated by these large governments, large corporations and whatnot.
Yeah, well, it's exactly that. Science is a method. It is, in and of itself, it doesn't have a direction. It's given direction by those who utilize the method.
Yeah.
And that direction is defined by the values of the people that are moving. Like, it's, if you want to dominate the world, all of your science is going to be invested in how you're going to do that, how you're going to attain that goal. If you want the world to be atheist, you're going to invest money in trying to make that happen. And you might make certain revolutions that might influence that movement in that direction. But this is all presupposing a lot of things. And when, it's often neglected when you're talking to, say, like the dogmatic atheist that just wants to deny that this is the case, that science is concerned only with the truth, and that truth is the highest value. And it's like, you're neglecting here our relationship to truth. That there's different forms of truth, and how what you want depends on how you see what truth is. Like, certain truths might manifest depending on what your goal is, and you might neglect other truths, because they interfere with that goal. And this is constantly occurring within the scientific community, within politics, within religious groups, be that Muslims, atheists, Christians.
Yeah. And I recently spoke about, I made, I think, 2 videos on this recently, about naturalism in science, methodological naturalism. And I made a response to Sean Carroll, who is making this, he's an atheist physicist, he's making this very poor argument that in physics, chemistry, biology, anthropology, social sciences, you don't find scientists talking about God. Therefore, naturalism has won, as if that's an argument. When that's the very rule in science, post-Darwin, that they subscribe to methodological naturalism. So cause and effects have to be explained naturalistically. There is no God, no immaterial mind, no soul, nothing metaphysical. There's no metaphysical ontological principles of morals or anything else. It's just all material. That's just an assumption in science. That's not a conclusion. But because of the way that they want the current world order, they want people to be away from religion, be away from God, they use these very poor arguments. Of course, there's no link between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism, because philosophers point this out. But because psychologically it works, look at all these scientists, they're not talking about God, therefore there's no God. And then feeble-minded, simpleton people who have, because most people have this type of behavior where they just accept authorities. They're just like, okay, that makes sense. And therefore there must be not a God.
The
and
thing
it's
is as
interesting.
well, sorry,
Yeah, go
I was just going to say, it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's necessary. You can't have everyone being a leader. You can't have everyone saying, oh no, we're going to go this way, we're going to go that way. I think it's somewhat necessary in a society that you have a certain amount of people that get certain jobs done, and that to be able to get these jobs done, there's a certain submissiveness that's involved in that. And
Yeah.
if there wasn't any submissiveness, there wouldn't be anything getting done. There'd just be
It'd
conflict.
be like herding cats.
Yeah, exactly. There'd just be like, it'd be madness
Going all over the place.
And so it is somewhat necessary for a society to have a number of people that are submissive. And you see this in the West, in the East, pretty much all over the planet. But it is necessary. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that people are led like that. Like, for example, my family, they're all from Poland, and they pretty much all of them live on farms, and they're very simple people, but they get a certain job done, and they don't need too much complexity, because if they do, it complicates their job. They just need to get what they need to get done. And that has consequences when you take them away from the farm and you inject them into a city. There's a massive culture shift there, and it affects them, and the way they deal with people in the cities comes across as clumsy and awkward, but in their own function and where they're from, it's not that weird. It's because they don't have that much stimulation. There's not that much going on. Life is simple, and they don't need to overcomplicate things. They have their roles and they fulfill them, and so it kind of comes down to, I think it's the art of war. And we're playing these games, and we understand that the scientists as well, and the atheists, they understand that they're not going to be able to prove rationally to absolutely everyone this is the case, and that everyone is just going to follow these rational deductions and so on and so forth. And so everyone on all of these sides, they're all playing their part in trying to shift the herd. And there is this understanding that a lot of people are herd-like, and they're trying to take advantage of that. Richard Dawkins, in his interview with Joe Rogan, he even spoke about, he made these weird conflicts in his discussion, where at the beginning he was like, oh, it's terrible that these religious people teach kids stuff. They shouldn't be teaching kids stuff. That's indoctrination. And then it's like, oh, so what age range are you aiming your book at? He's like, oh, kids. He's like, oh. So it's all right to teach kids then? Or is it not? Like, what is it? Is it just that because you happen to believe these things, it's okay?
As long as it's your product, it's fine.
It's not even as though it's necessarily the case that you make people atheists, that you make them good. Like
even he admitted that recently, bro. He actually wrote, he's worried about, I don't remember the exact words, but the decline of religion and morality. He actually said something about this quite recently, that you need some sort of, because this was based upon a recent study he was talking about. I think it was somewhere in the north of England, where they had a cafeteria, and what you had to do is you would walk in there, you'd get a coffee, there's nobody there to serve you, and then there was where you're supposed to pay, there's just like a box, and you put in the money, but no one's telling you that you have to do that. There's no staff there. So they conducted the experiment, and then they conducted it again, but this time they stuck a pair of eyes, fake eyes, on the wall or something. And the amount of, this is a real study, and the amount of people who put money in because of those fake eyes actually increased.
Well, it's a sociological principle.
Stick, to be honest.
I think my missus, she was studying sociology at some point in college, and she was telling me about this, and that people act differently when they think they're being watched. And it's true. It's the case. And if you don't feel like you're being watched, it doesn't happen. But there's also another weird thing. I did a big walk from Manchester to Glasgow, and when I got out of the cities,
Wait, hang on. You need to slow this down here. I'm like really tired. It's like 11 o'clock. Did I just hear that right? You just walked from Manchester to Edinburgh.
It was a few years ago. I wanted to try camping along the way and to see if I could do it. But when I got out of the city, we got into I was walking with my dog, and we got into the countryside, and there was a really weird thing that started happening where you just get these stalls that would pop up, and there was no one around, but there'd be like jars of honey, jars of jam, there'd be books and things, and then like you said, there'd be a tub, but there was no eyes or anything on the cupboards or anything. It was just like, this is this much, that is that much, leave the money in the box. And like they were so incredibly trusting, and there was something really beautiful about the fact that they were so trusting that it made you not want to steal from them. So you made sure that you put the money in there, you only took what you wanted, and and it was so common that they mustn't, in the countryside, they mustn't have issues with people stealing things from them or anything like that.
They're not used to Londoners, bro. That's what it is.
Well, yeah, but I think maybe it's got to
ransack the place.
Well, if you've got more people in a crowd, the power of the crowd gives anonymity. So
Yes.
it'd be much harder to find the culprit in a group of 1 million people than it is in a group of 10, 20. And like, if everyone knows everyone, there's no like mystery in terms of social connections. Like that person knows that person, that blah, 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 blah. And it's harder to hide in these smaller communities.
Yep.
And when you introduce this idea of the city, the high rise, and like there's so many people that you don't even know who lives next door to you. It brings this element of a lack of community or a lack of unity, and this whole principle of might makes right. Like if I can get away with it, it's going to make me, it's going to put me in a better position. So why should I not? And you have this issue all over in every city, no matter where you go. You can go to Thailand, Bangkok, Pakistan, and the cities there. You can come to the UK. Like each city, when you have a large congregation of people and a lack of a sense of community, you end up with large issues to do with crimes and things like that, or a lack of morality.
Definitely. So anyway, it's been really good. I think we've pretty much covered everything.
I think so.
Of course, like I mentioned before, if you've made it this far in this video, then make sure you do read the whole article. It's really, really good. Next time, inshallah, with Yusuf, we will probably go through his dissertation with a fine comb. Maybe you could just give us a little tidbits about. Actually, you did that at the beginning, didn't you? Was that
I did that. Yeah, it was. Yeah. So basically, nihilism. What nihilism is, how people have responded.
What was your actual? Because with every dissertation, you're supposed to give a niche perspective. So, what was your something new
conclusion
that you added?
What was my thesis? Well, it was mainly to do with the fact that everyone needs to acknowledge the fact that nihilism is coming, and it is a strong force, and it's going to be the result of the fact of this globalized society. And the Muslim world is going to deal with this as well. And so it's important for the Muslims to be aware of this, because Muslims are coming to the West. People are moving over from the West to the Muslim world. And we've got this mixing pot occurring. And it's this mixing pot that really starts to give rise to this questioning. It's like, one of the common things that I have on Twitter is people will message me from Muslim backgrounds. So their family are Muslim, everyone around them is Muslim, and they're having doubts. And one of the major doubts is that what are the chances that I was born into the right religion? They've not questioned it. Whenever they try to question it, they get a very negative reaction from the family. And people are very touchy about this subject, about like, well, why Islam? Why? And again, not everyone is academic.
They can't articulate it.
Yeah,
they can't.
So it's a scary conversation for them.
In the past with, major Islamic figures, they would actually have specialists who would be there to actually articulate Islam. And even here in Pakistan, you get people like this. And it doesn't take much to actually speak to them, but no one's spoken to them before.
Yeah, and this fear is enough of a force to push people away from Islam as well.
Yes.
And which is why I think it's incredibly important that we deal with this. We have to confront the reality that nihilism is something that is coming, and even from like a Islamic perspective, you can look at nihilism as the onset of the realm of the Dajjal. Like once you've inputted enough confusion into the society so that they can't distinguish right from wrong, they're unable to pick up from down, or like
everything's relative.
Everything becomes relative. Then once you've gotten a society like that on a global scale, power is what determines what is right. And all it takes then is whoever happens to have the most money when that occurs, the most power, the most influence on the world, they are going to be the ones that determine, what everyone should be doing, what's right, what's wrong, what are the laws, what's this, what's that. And if technology is advanced to such the point that they don't even need an army anymore, which it looks like is what's occurring at the moment. If you think about how the West deals with its wars, it's very minimal. They don't even have to send that many troops anymore. They just send the drones, and the drones can be controlled from back home. They don't even need to leave the country. And you look at things like these companies that are dealing with AI and robotics, and the things that these machines can do now. It's not going to be long until whoever's in power doesn't need an army, and doesn't need to rely upon the masses anymore. And if that situation arises, everyone's going to have to deal with this. And so, this article, or my dissertation, it was just trying to kind of outline the necessity of faith, whether or not you want faith or not, and whether you're an atheist or a believer, you have to have faith in things. And that we just differ in what we choose to have faith in. That nihilism is something that's going to occur, that people have tried to deal with this in different ways, from the theists to the atheists, and then how all of this has a massive knock-on effect on the will to meaning, and what we find meaningful and how we find it meaningful. And then as well, how we see things like free will and responsibility, and whether or not, if the world is meaningless and everything's determined, and there's no such thing as free will, like Sam Harris seems to be hell-bent on trying to convince everyone, then responsibility dissolves, the legal system dissolves. How can you be considered guilty for a crime if it wasn't your fault, if you didn't choose to do it?
Or even, with the likes of Sam Harris pointing his finger towards other people and telling them to adopt the liberal worldview. They don't have a free will. What's the point of pointing towards them, So anyway, next time, inshallah, we will, it depends on actually the viewers. The viewers may go through your blog and may say, okay, we want to cover another topic. But yeah, do check out the blog, ponderingsoul.org or .com?
.blog. Pondering.soul.blog, all one word. You can check my channel out, just search Pondering Soul. And then I'm on Twitter as well, at Yusuf Ponders. I'm in the process of...
and YouTube as well.
YouTube, Pondering Soul.
Pondering Soul. Okay, Jazakallah khair for joining us today and giving us your precious time. And we're going to be joining you for the future. And as always, I hope that everybody who's come all the way through to the end of this video really realizes the deluded view which I often speak about, which is the view of scientism, that science gives us truth, science gives us certainty, it's the main root of knowledge. We can start to see that, look, you don't even have to be Muslim to recognize that Western philosophers have realized that there is more to this idea that science is some sort of objective thing, which is going to give you certainty, which is free of all human values. No, actually, there's a lot more to it than that. So,
which is why
that we've said is, sorry?
Which is why the West is having to deal with this postmodern crisis.
Yes,
it's specific to them, and it arises out of all these issues and the neglect of it.
And, it's a monster that they've created themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
So everything good we have said, myself and Yusuf, is from Allah, and every mistake is from ourselves. Jazakallah khair for listening, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.